Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. After months of negotiations, President Biden is signing one of the two major pieces of his legislative agenda. The president was joined by members of both parties as he signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill into law this afternoon on the White House South Lawn. The bill is significantly scaled down from where it began, but President Biden framed the deal as proof Washington can get something done.
I know you're tired of the bickering in Washington, frustrated by the negativity, and you just want us to use and focus on your needs, your concerns, and the conversations that are taking place at your kitchen table. We hear you and we see you. The bill I'm about to sign along is proof that despite the cynics, Democrats and Republicans can come together and deliver results.
The White House now faces a more significant battle in passing the president's social and climate investment plan. The legislative calendar poses a significant challenge with few working days before Congress leaves for the holidays. Lawmakers still need to avert a U.S. debt default and a government shutdown in just over 2 weeks. Still, the Biden administration remains optimistic, even as some Democratic senators suggest their vote is still up for grabs.
He can't determine how everybody's going to vote in Congress. We know that, but he does. He is somebody who wants to govern for all people, pursue opportunities to work in a bipartisan way. Today is a great example of that, and we'll continue to look for ways to do it moving forward.
President Biden is also holding his first bilateral meeting tonight with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The virtual meeting is focusing on stretched supply chains, human rights, and tariffs, which were a significant point of contention with the Trump administration. One of the former president's longtime advisors appeared in federal court after turning himself in this morning. Steve Bannon agreed to weekly check-ins before his trial on charges of contempt of Congress for ignoring a subpoena from the House Capitol Riot Committee. Let's bring in Skyler Henry and Tamara Keith. Skyler covers the White House and Congress for CBS News, and Tamara is a White House correspondent for NPR. Welcome. It's good to have you both. Tamara, let me start with you. The bipartisan infrastructure deal is now law. So what's next? What's the latest on the president's social and climate spending plan?
They are waiting on some scores from the Congressional Budget Office. That was very Washington lingo of me, but essentially to find out how much what was that?
It was very much a Washington lingo, but basically they want to know how much it costs from the referee who's impartial, right?
Yes, exactly. From the nonpartisan budget scorekeeper, the Congressional Budget Office. They're waiting to see how much it costs. I think one challenge that Democrats are going to have to work through is some Democrats see this as urgent and necessary. Others are less convinced. Some of the moderates, like Senator Joe Manchin, who we've heard so much about. And there are also some Democrats who are raising alarms about inflation. And so the question going forward is, are they going to be able to convince the more moderate Democrats who have some concerns that, in fact, this is not inflationary or wouldn't be too inflationary, or that it would potentially help people who are being affected by inflation. So there's a lot to work out. And as you showed with that timeline, there's not a lot of time to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, Skyler, Congress is back in session this week, but out for Thanksgiving next week. And the end of the year is quickly approaching. What else do they still need to get done?
Right. Well, the list is certainly long, Elaine, in terms of things that need to get done, and a crowded legislative agenda. At least we saw that from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who laid out a timeline of what he hopes the Senate will be able to address before everything's all wrapped up next month. But over in the House, we heard Speaker Pelosi say this here at the White House, talk about how she wants to move forward with the Build Back Better plan. And over in the Senate, we know that it will probably spend a lot of that time trying to convince most of its moderate members, you all were just talking about, Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, on trying to get them to buy in to walk in lockstep with other Democrats, given that their votes are so desperately needed in order to move that plan forward. But Majority Leader Schumer also talked about wanting to bring the National Defense Authorization Act to the floor as well. That is a can, if you will, that has been kicked down the road for the past few months, and so that could be significant. He also talked about wanting to address fair and free elections as well, and also try to move forward with some of the executive and judicial nominees that the president has as well. So a lot of things that have to move forward also. And you talked about this, Elaine, December 3rd, which is a date that has been circled by many here in Washington, that lawmakers will have to try to figure out something in terms of avoiding a government shutdown. Will they have some sort of stopgap piece of legislation to try to move that forward? All of that remains to be seen. But we know this, that they plan on getting to work.
Well, Tamara, let's talk a bit about some numbers that could have some bearing on President Biden's political capital. So according to a new ABC News Washington Post poll, in June, 94% of Democrats approved of the way President Biden was handling his job. That number has now dropped to 80%. What do you think might be behind that?
Yeah, Press Secretary Jen Psaki was asked today about this poll, and she described it as signs of opportunity. The president has a lot of opportunity, or needs to take that opportunity to try to improve his standing. And part of, as you point out, part of why his approval rating is so dismal is because Democrats are not 100% happy with his performance either. But think about what's happened since June. You know, in June, everybody was flying high, thinking their vaccines were going to work forever. And then there was the Delta wave that really made people rethink whether the pandemic was over. And Democrats feel this. Democrats who are more worried about the pandemic than Republicans feel this more acutely. Then you get the Build Back Better plan not passing, Democrats fighting among themselves. It's no wonder that he's seeing some slippage among his own party. President Biden is not a figure like former President Donald Trump, who demands loyalty from his party at every turn.
All right, let's go ahead and bring into our conversation Tara Palmeri. Tara is the co-author of the Politico Playbook. Tara, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. So 81-year-old Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy announced his retirement. What does that mean for a closely divided Senate as midterms approach, and how might Bernie Sanders impact who fills Leahy's seat?
That's a good question. So he's one of the longest serving Democratic senator in the Senate. He is he's kind of a known figure around Capitol Hill because he actually won in the midterms right after Watergate, and that's when he entered into the Senate. And you know, he's already sort of given a hat tip to his successor, Congressman Peter Welch. He said, you know, he's a remarkable man and he's trying to lay the groundwork for his own legacy. But you know, Senator Bernie Sanders has a really strong base in Vermont and could end up recruiting a candidate that's a little bit further to the left, which would change the dynamics, obviously, in the Senate. And, you know, with the Democratic Party that's very divided right now, it'll be interesting to see if Bernie brings on another hardliner and if he's able to recruit someone that Vermonters want to elect.
Something we'll keep an eye on. Shifting gears, Skyler, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said the Senate will take up the National Defense Authorization Act this week. Is that expected to be controversial at all?
Well, it could be. We know one of the big things that's part of that is the USICA, that's the Innovation and Competition Act, which would certainly bolster some of these supply chains that we've seen issues with in the past few weeks and months. That's something that has a lot of lawmakers' attention, as well as many Americans across the country, especially as we head into this busy holiday season. But also part of that is funding that traditionally has been addressed relatively quickly over the past few decades. This is a bill, if you will, that has moved forward for some time now, but you have many critics of the majority leader who've said that he's actually held this close to the vest for some time, when most of this legislation had been approved in the House for the past few months, and many were wondering what was taking Leader Schumer so long in order to get this brought up. But he did say this week, as you mentioned, this is something that he plans on bringing to the floor this week. One only has to wonder what will happen next.
Well, Tamara, we see that President Biden is going to be visiting the key primary state of New Hampshire on Tuesday. What should we make of his decision to visit that state, and do we know anything more about his 2024 plans?
Well, and I will also point out that he's going to Detroit this week in Michigan. If you look at a map of where President Biden has traveled, it is shockingly similar to the map of states that would be considered battlegrounds in a presidential election. Also, New Hampshire, I should note, does have a Senate race this year. And so the president may be there to also bolster the Democratic senator who is running for re-election. President Biden has not said that he's not running. He has, in fact, said that he is running. Whether he is running or not, you see lots of quotes, even on the record quotes from allies of his who talk about a future where he may not be running for president in 2024. But of course, he absolutely has to, at this point, act like a man who is running for re-election. And certainly his travel schedule would indicate that he's visiting all the right states.
Yeah, as you look at that map, it is very clear these are battleground state stops anyway, when you look at past elections. All right, well, Tara, former Trump advisor Steve Bannon surrendered to the FBI on contempt of Congress charges. What is the status of others who refuse to cooperate with the investigation?
Well, I know that the select committee that is overseeing these hearings is really this, this arrest will prompt them to cooperate, right? I know that the others, like Kash Patel and Mark Meadows, through their lawyers, they are communicating with the committee, whereas Steve Bannon completely flagrantly ignored the committee. And so I think for them, this was a really big deal for the DOJ to step up and to hold him in contempt. And so, the question is, does this prompt people like Michael Flynn to now participate? He's also been subpoenaed, and there's been very little from him. But as always with Steve Bannon, he created a circus around his surrender, had it streamed on a conservative social media site, Getter. He was talking on his podcast, and he's sort of turning this into a way to cement himself into GOP martyrdom, and using this very a stretch of an excuse that he had executive privilege, even though he had worked in the White House since 2017, and that's why he couldn't respond.
Right. Meantime, Skyler, the president held a Tribal Nations summit at the White House today. What came out of that?
Yeah, well, the president talked about some of the investments being made in the Native community, particularly with the American Rescue Plan, given that that community was so heavily impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. He also talked about the money set aside, the billions of dollars, some $13 billion that will be set aside in this infrastructure plan to go towards that community, particularly as it pertains to child care and the investment in universal pre-K as well. But he also went on to talk about 5 other initiatives that he wanted to address, particularly in that community. Part of that has to deal with federal land management as well as climate change, but then also talking about ways to protect Native Americans against violent crimes and things like that. We saw several executive orders that the president talked about as well, all different investments that the administration is now looking to do to try to make sure that the Native American community doesn't get left out when we talk about this bipartisan infrastructure bill.
And finally, Tamara, what kind of expectations surround this virtual summit between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping?
Yeah, this is a meeting that is fairly delayed in that a new president traditionally would have met with a Chinese leader sooner, but Xi Jinping did not attend some of these international summits. He hasn't left China since the coronavirus pandemic took hold. And the relationship is particularly troubled at this time. President Biden and President Xi have met several times back when President Biden was vice president, but President Biden makes it clear with almost every speech he gives, whether it be the infrastructure speech today or others, that he sees China as a significant global competitor and an area of concern. He believes competing with China is an incredibly important part of U.S. domestic policy, and that plus concerns about human rights violations in China. they're not telling us to anticipate a bunch of deliverables. They're saying that this meeting is more about rekindling, re-cementing the relationship as best you can over a video screen instead of in person.
Yeah, it's a very different dynamic doing it virtually. All right, Skyler Henry, Tamara Keith, and Tara Palmeri, thank you all very much.